Okay, let's dive right into this absolutely bizarre and honestly kind of fascinating medical case file from the world of veterinary pathology. In today's explainer, we're taking a close look at a disease that sounds like a literal fairy tale curse, but is actually a very real, scientifically grounded nightmare for certain livestock. We're talking about the pathology and pathogenesis of a condition colloquially known as wooden tongue. I absolutely love breaking down these specific cases because by the time we're done here, you're going to see exactly how a microscopic organism manages to completely hijack the biology of a massive animal. So start by asking yourself this. What actually happens when a cow's tongue literally turns to wood? Just imagine the visceral reality of an animal whose absolute most crucial muscle for eating, for taking in basic life-sustaining nutrition, suddenly becomes completely stiff and completely paralyzed. For a grazing animal, the tongue isn't just about taste. It's their primary tool for grasping and pulling in food. So when that tool is compromised, their very survival is immediately on the line. It's a wildly dramatic physical transformation, and today we're going to put on our medical detective hats to figure out exactly how and why this happens.
Section 1. The Wooden Tongue Mystery, Investigating the Victim and the Culprit.
The formal medical term for this whole ordeal is Actinobacillosis. It's a specific infectious disease caused by a bacteria called Actinobacillus ligonarisi. And what's really fascinating about our culprit here is its highly selective nature. It primarily targets cattle. Now, it can also affect sheep, but that's notably rare. But here's the real kicker. It doesn't occur at all in other species. We aren't dealing with some generalized, opportunistic bug that attacks anything with a pulse. This is a highly specialized pathogen that zeroes in on a very specific set of hosts to perform its, well, horrifying transformation of soft tissue.
Moving on to Section 2. How the Infection Strikes, the Inside Job.
What's truly wild about this is how the criminal actually accesses the crime scene. See, this isn't a case of a contagion blowing in on the wind or lurking in a dirty water trough just waiting to invade from the outside. No, this is a shocking inside job. Step 1. Actinobacillus ligonarisi is already there. It lives perfectly normally and peacefully right in the oral cavity of cattle and sheep, just hanging out as part of their regular microscopic flora. But then step 2 happens. The animal suffers a traumatic injury in its mouth. Maybe the cow chews on a particularly sharp piece of forage or a thorny branch or something like that. That simple scratch or cut, that's all it takes. Because in step 3, the bacteria exploits that fresh injury, crossing the threshold into the deep soft tissues where the infection rapidly takes hold. The enemy was literally inside the gates the entire time. Okay, Section 3, examining the gross lesions, the physical evidence. Now let's look at the actual physical evidence of the disease, starting with the absolute devastation of the primary infection site. The normal, highly flexible muscle of the tongue gets aggressively replaced by fibrinous connective tissue. It's essentially packing the tongue with rigid, scar-like material. The end result? A tongue that becomes incredibly hard, a bit shrunken, and completely immobile. But the diffuse proliferation, the widespread spreading of this connective tissue, it doesn't stop there. It can cause such massive, rapid enlargement that the stiffened, essentially paralyzed tongue actually protrudes visibly from the animal's mouth. This is the hallmark clinical sign, and it's exactly why it earned the very literal moniker, wooden tongue. But unfortunately, the damage isn't entirely confined to just that woody proliferation. Within the tongue itself, you'll usually find these small abscesses scattered all throughout. And even more tellingly, the infection travels to the local lymph nodes. Here, it forms distinct abscesses filled with an abundant, purulent exudate, which is a fancy medical way of saying a thick, smooth, shiny pus. As a pathologist or a vet, spotting this particular thick, shiny pus in the lymph nodes is a crucial, visceral clue in our investigation. And while it's a bit less common, the infection can actually spread even farther, causing smaller abscesses to pop up in the lungs and other internal tissues. Now, this brilliantly illustrates the difference between our prime suspect and a very common copycat disease. On the left, we have our current subject, Actinobacillosis, which heavily favors soft tissues in cattle, like the tongue and the lymph nodes we just talked about. But on the right, we have actinomycosis. Now, they sound super similar, right? And they can even produce similar-looking lesions. But actinomycosis is an infection that is much more common in the bones, like the jawbone. This preference, soft tissue versus bone, is a major dividing line when you're trying to figure out exactly what is attacking the animal. Which brings us to Section 4, under the microscope, identifying the fingerprints. So while the gross physical lesions might vaguely resemble that copycat disease we just mentioned, sliding a tissue sample under the microscope reveals the real truth. We have to zoom way in.
The bacterial colonies of our wooden tongue pathogen are generally smaller. Plus, the structures known as radiating clubs, they are distinctly longer and a lot more slender. There's also that abundant purulent exudate we touched on earlier. But the real dead giveaway? The organisms themselves are gram-negative, meaning they show up a very specific color under a standard chemical stain, and they're rod-shaped.
And then there is this incredible little detail. They produce sulfur granules, which are rosette-shaped. Finding these distinct rosette-shaped sulfur granules under the microscope is honestly one of the most uniquely beautiful, yet structurally destructive markers of this whole disease. It's like a perfect architectural signature left behind by the bacteria.
All right, Section 5, making the final diagnosis, closing the case.
So how do we officially close this medical case file and rule out all the other microscopic suspects once and for all? Well, in tissue sections, pathologists search for one specific undeniable marker, gram-negative material right smack in the center of the bacterial colonies. Finding that exact gram-negative center is completely sufficient to definitively separate Actinobacillosis from a whole lineup of similar-looking infections. It differentiates it from the bone-loving actinomycosis, it differentiates it from nocardiosis, and it definitively separates it from staphylococcal infections, also known as botryomycosis. That single slide preparation basically acts as the final gavel drop on our diagnosis. And finally, Section 6, the full variant, an accomplice revealed. Now, just when you thought the case was closed and we fully understood this little bacterial family, there's a startling final twist. I want to introduce you to a very closely related variant, Actinobacillus equili. Instead of targeting the mouths of cattle and sheep, this pathogen completely abandons them to ravage horses, specifically young foals, though it does occasionally strike adults. And instead of creating a wooden tongue, it attacks the incredibly vulnerable early stages of a horse's life. It's actually the main cause of these devastating conditions known as joint ill and navel ill. It rapidly triggers generalized septicemia or severe blood poisoning in these young animals. It's a completely different method of destruction, utilizing a very similar biological engine to create these devastating infections right at the very start of these foals' lives. This whole explainer really highlights a kind of terrifying reality of biology. Think about it. If devastating pathogens like the ones that cause wooden tongue are already living naturally, just peacefully existing inside the host, waiting for a simple scratch from a piece of hay to unleash total destruction, well, what other hidden microscopic threats are we or the animals we care for unknowingly carrying around right now? It really makes you rethink the hidden dangers of every minor scrape, cut, or injury, doesn't it? Thank you so much for hanging out with me on this deep dive into the fascinating, if slightly unsettling world of veterinary pathology. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.